Ergativity for Novices Part 2.1 Split Ergativity. This video is an adaptation of a thread called Ergativity for Novices on the ZBB written by Bradron, who kindly permitted me to reproduce it in this form. I have edited and trimmed it, but it remains mostly the same. You can find a link to Part 0, the introduction, and Part 1, Morphological Ergativity, in the description below, which I highly recommend looking at before this one because it goes over certain terminology we'll be using. This section on split ergativity itself is in 3 parts. This first part focuses on the foundations of split ergativity as well as active-stative systems, and the next parts will focus on other different types of split ergativity. Introduction to split ergativity. In the previous parts, I briefly mentioned split ergativity. This term refers to a situation in which an ergative alignment is only used in some situations. There is a split between ergative-absolutive alignment and some other alignment. The other alignment will usually be nominative-accusative, although more complex splits can include tripartite and direct alignments. For instance, although Diabol is an ergative language, as mentioned in previous videos in this series, it uses nominative-accusative alignment in its pronouns. Ngana banaganyu, ngana nyorrana buran, nyorra banaganyu. What is odd about split ergativity is not that it exists. There are many other weird and wonderful alignment systems out there, but just how common it is. Almost every known quote-unquote ergative language has some sort of split in its alignment. This is a notable asymmetry between nominative-accusative and ergative-absolutive systems. There are very many languages with an entirely nominative-accusative system, although these often have the occasional ergative construction as an exception. But in almost all languages with an ergative-absolutive alignment, they have some sort of obvious split. I have no idea why this is, although I would very much like to know. There are several different varieties of split found across split ergative languages. Splits by the nature of the verb, split S and fluid S systems, collectively known as active-stative. Splits by the nature of the argument, i.e. animacy hierarchy-based systems. Splits by tense, aspect, or mood. Splits by clause type, i.e. main or subordinate, or combinations of the above. Each of these will be covered. The basis of split ergativity. Before understanding the details of how each variety of split ergativity works, it is often very useful to understand the underlying motivations behind why split ergative systems exist. There exist several different phenomena which can underlie split ergativity, and these will be dealt with here. Recall that in Part 0, I said the following about A and O. The A relation represents the argument which prototypically controls the event, while the O relation represents the argument which prototypically does not control the event. To clarify, here I use the phrase controls the event to mean most relevant to the success of the activity, or could initiate or control the activity, according to Dixon. Other synonyms are volition and agentivity, the opposite of which is patientivity. Now recall that the unmarked case in a nominative-accusative system is the nominative, ignoring marked nominative systems, which covers A, whereas the unmarked case in an ergative-absolutive system is the absolutive, which covers P. But as the quote above states, A is the argument which is prototypically in control, whereas P is the argument which prototypically is not in control. Combining these two observations leads to the following fact, which is highly relevant for a split ergative system. In a nominative-accusative system, the agent or controller is unmarked, whereas in an ergative-absolutive system, the patient or undergoer is unmarked. This fact is the basis of many split ergative systems. Accusative alignment will be used for arguments which are more likely to be agentive, whereas ergative alignment will be used for arguments which are more likely to be patientive. Another factor which can motivate a split is the status of S. Based on the statement above about the volition of A and O, we might attempt to determine whether S should most naturally be grouped with A or with O on semantic grounds. But it becomes clear very quickly that this fails. With some verbs, such as speak, the S argument is in control of the activity, whereas with other verbs, such as break, the S argument is not in control of the activity. Even worse, there are verbs such as laugh, in which S is sometimes in control and other times not. You can make a forced voluntary laugh, or you can laugh involuntarily. And there are still other verbs, such as move, in which some choices for S are interpreted as being in control, e.g., I move, while other arguments are interpreted as being out of control, e.g., it moves. Clearly, S cannot be identified conclusively as being either the controlling agent or the controlled patient. But as we saw earlier, nominative-accusative alignment groups S with agentive A, whereas ergative-absolutive alignment groups S with patientive P. Thus, in some split systems, accusative alignment will be used when S is more agentive, but ergative alignment will be used when S is more patientive. Note that, as with the previous conclusion, nominative-accusative alignment ends up associated with agentivity, whereas ergative-absolutive alignment ends up associated with patientivity. A third factor which can motivate the split is the structure of the discourse. In some discourse structures, the S argument and A argument naturally go together. In others, the S argument and O argument naturally go together. This can lead to a split between nominative-accusative alignment for the former types of discourse and ergative-absolutive alignment for the latter types. Dixon argues that this is the motivation behind splits on tense, aspect, and mood, although I personally find his reasoning doubtful. Splits by the nature of the verb. Probably the simplest variety of split to understand is a split by the nature of the verb. As discussed before, an intransitive verb may have a more agent-like S or a more patient-like S. Thus, it is impossible to group S consistently with either A or O. So-called active-stative systems solve this problem in an obvious way, grouping S with A when S is more agent-like, but grouping S with O when S is more patient-like. There are two main systems used to accomplish this: split S systems and fluid S systems. Split S systems. Split S systems divide intransitive verbs into two groups. Some intransitive verbs mark S the same as A, and others mark S the same as O. As outlined earlier, the former marking is generally used for verbs where S is typically in control of the action, whereas the latter marking is used for verbs in which S is typically not in control of the action, or which represent a state. Although, of course, there are differences between languages in exactly which verbs go into which group. I will call the former group S equals A verbs, and the latter group S equals O verbs, and their arguments S equals A NP and S equals O NP, NP meaning noun phrase, which gives four different types of verbal argument, namely A, O, S equals A, and S equals O, although terminology differs. For instance, Dixon calls the verbs and arguments S subscript A and S subscript O instead. Other terms include active for S equals A and stative for S equals O. It may be useful to elaborate on exactly how such a system works. As we will see, the majority of languages using a split S system use verbal agreement affixes rather than case markers. A typical split S system uses two sets of agreement affixes. One set of affixes is used for both S and A, while the other is used for both S and O. Using the names of the corresponding case markers, we might term the first set nominative and the second set absolutive, although, curiously enough, I actually don't think I've seen those names used anywhere else. For a normal transitive verb, A is signalled using the nominative set and O is signalled using the absolutive set. For instance, I hit you would be expressed as some variant of hit, first person singular nominative, second person singular absolutive, although of course the affixes could be in different places depending on the language. However, for an intransitive verb, the argument could be marked with either set since they overlap for the S argument. S equal A verbs are those which use the nominative set for agreement, whereas S equals O verbs are those which use the absolutive set for agreement. For instance, if enter is an S equal A verb, then I enter would be expressed as enter, first person singular nominative. If weep is an S equal O verb, then I weep would be expressed as weep, first person singular, absolutive. Now, going back to the verbs themselves, note that the exact semantic basis for S equals A versus S equal O verbs can differ from language to language, although it is always some variant of the volitionality distinction described above. For instance, Mithen, 1991, as cited in Dixon, describes the semantic basis of S equals A versus S equals O in Lakota, Caddo, and Mohawk by saying that prototypical S equals A arguments perform, affect, instigate, and control events, whereas prototypical S equals O arguments are affected, things happen or have happened to them. Mithen also investigated the changes in this distinction over time, although Dixon doesn't go into any detail on these changes. McGregor, 1997, has proposed that verbs appear in a hierarchy, starting from verbs of cognition and speech, and extending through violence, causation, states, and ending at existentials. He suggests that verbs to the left of the hierarchy usually show accusative marking, whereas verbs to the right usually show ergative marking. Cultural differences can also play a role in assigning intransitive verbs to groups, with Dixon giving the example of the word vomit. Some cultures see this as an involuntary activity, while in others it may be induced volitionally as a cultural activity. And, as with all linguistic distinctions, there are always a few exceptions to the general rule, often through borrowing or phonological change. For instance, Guarani borrows all Spanish intransitives as S equals A, leading to unexpected S equals A verbs like aburri, to be bored, although the native Guarani verb igua, to be or become bored, is S equals O, as expected. The sizes of the two classes can also vary greatly. According to Merlin in 1985, as again cited in Dixon, Arikara has a small closed S equals O class and a large open S equals A class, whereas Dakota has a small closed S equals A class and a large open S equals O class, while Guarani treats both classes as open. To give some concrete examples, Dixon lists some representative verbs for 3 languages. For the Siouan language Mandan, S equals A verbs include break camp, enter, arrive, think it over, and go, while S equals O verbs include fall, be lost, lose balance. S equals O also includes adjectival verbs such as to be alive, be brave, and be strong. For the Tupi Guarani language, Guarani, S equals A verbs include go, remain, continue, follow, fall, which was S equals O in Mandan, while S equals O verbs include those with adjectival meanings, but also remember, forget, tell a lie, and weep. Interestingly, although the personal affixes for S equals A verbs are exactly the same as the A affixes for transitive verbs, the personal affixes for S equals O verbs are only very similar, but not identical, to the O affixes for transitive verbs. For the Siouan language Hidatsa, the two classes are not quite as distinct as in the 2 previous examples. S equals A includes talk, follow, run, bathe, and sing, but also have hiccups, forget, and die, whereas S equals O includes yawn, err, cry, fall down, but also stand up, roll over, and dress up. In some languages, the distinction between S equals A and S equals O verbs goes further than just marking. For instance, in the Athabascan language Slavi, causatives can be based on S equals O, but not on S equals A. Passive on S equals A, but not S equals O. Noun incorporation can involve O or S equals O, but not S equals A, and so on. We might justify this by saying, for instance, passives are mainly used to background an agent, so must be used on verbs which have an agent, and noun incorporation is used to background a patient, so can only be used on verbs which have a patient, and so on and so forth, although this feels suspiciously like a post hoc rationalization. As another example, Guarani imperative inflection can occur with transitive verbs and S equals A verbs, but not S equals O verbs. Conversely, some languages have constructions in which S equals O and S equals A arguments are combined as a unitary S class. For instance, in subordinate clauses, many Tupi-Guarani languages use O agreement affixes for all S arguments. As another example, the Caddoan language Wichita normally has a distinction between s equals a and s equals o in transitive arguments, but it has several constructions which group a unitary s argument with either a or o. For instance, a and s behave the same with respect to word order, and o and s behave the same with respect to noun incorporation. There is a very strong tendency for split S languages to mark their alignment using verbal agreement rather than noun case. All of the languages described above use verbal agreement. This isn't too surprising. Since the split is dependent on the nature of the verb rather than the nature of the noun, it makes sense for the split to be marked on the verb rather than the noun. Typically, there are two sets of affixes, one for a and one for o, and intransitive verbs use affixes either from the a set or the o set depending on the verb being used. However, there are a few more unusual systems in use. The Papuan language Yawa has a set of verbal agreement prefixes, but only for o and s equals o. A arguments are marked with a postposition, which is placed after the argument and inflects for person, number, and, in the third person, gender. For s equals a verbs, this postposition has developed into a verbal prefix, which is used in addition to the postposition. Thus, transitive sentences contain a, marked with a postposition, o, and a verb agreeing with o. Intransitive sentences with s equals o contain s equals o and a verb, agreeing with s equals o using the o agreement markers, and intransitive sentences with s equals a contain s equals a, marked with a postposition, and a verb, agreeing with s equals a using an agreement marker derived from the postposition. Note, I'm not really sure of the exact word order, I'm simply listing the constituents in each type of sentence, but not necessarily in order. The Austronesian language Tolai, mentioned in a previous video, has an unusual system working solely through word order. The word order in transitive clauses is AVO. In intransitive sentences, the word order is SV for s equals a verbs and VS for s equals o verbs. This makes Tolai a rare example of an ergative language where the ergativity is signalled only via word order. The Arawak language Waura has a similar system to Tolai, but the verb also contains an agreement marker. For transitive verbs and s equals a verbs, the verb agrees with a or s equals a, while this marker is absent with s equals o verbs. I would also like to briefly mention the system of Tongan. According to McGregor, Tongan has an unusual alignment system in which different types of verbs use different case marking techniques. A different type of split in case marking is found in languages such as Tongan, where bivalent verbs show different patterns in case marking. For instance, verbs of violence have an ergative marked agent and an unmarked undergoer. Verbs of feeling have an unmarked experiencer and a second argument in the locative or dative. The have verb takes two unmarked NPs, and various other patterns exist. Thus, in Tongan, the ergative patterning and case marking is restricted to higher transitivity event types, events that are more effective. This type of patterning could be thought of as an unusual variety of split S marking, albeit one which varies on bivalent words rather than univalent ones. Fluid S systems. Split S systems are certainly an improvement on having one unitary S class which is not distinguished for agentivity, but they still have a problem. The verb itself may not be sufficient to predict the agentivity of the S argument. As earlier, the example of vomit was given as a word whose agentivity is dependent on culture, but there are less contrived examples too. For instance, a sentence like, "the box moved," could either be agentive, maybe it's slipping down a slope, or patientive, maybe I'm pushing it. So-called fluid S systems avoid these problems. These fascinating systems are a bit like a more extreme version of split S systems. In split S systems, the choice of verb consistently determines whether S is marked like A or O. But in fluid S systems, S is marked like A or O depending on the agentivity of S in that particular sentence. Fluid S systems could be considered to be a combination of syntactic-based marking, for A and O, and semantically based marking, for S, using these terms as they were defined in Part 0 of this series. Perhaps an example might help illustrate how the system works. The most commonly referenced fluid S language is probably Tsovatush, also known as Bats or Batsby, from the northeastern Caucasian family. In Tsovatush, the S argument may be marked with either the nominative case, like A, or the absolutive case, like O, depending on the agentivity of S. Tcho naizdrach kritra, atcho naizdrach kritra. Note that this alternation only applies to intransitive verbs. Fluid S languages are the same as split S languages, and indeed the vast majority of languages with verbal agreement with regards to transitive verbs, in that transitive verbs always have A and O marked distinctly and in a consistent manner. Although this by no means precludes a contrast being expressed in some other way. For instance, the fluid S language Achinese has a special quote-unquote uncontrolled verbal prefix, to, used with transitive verbs to denote an action which is normally controlled, but in this instance happens by chance. As with split S languages, fluid S languages can certainly contain intransitive verbs, which are only ever used with one type of marking. However, unlike split S languages, this is not due to any inherent property of these words, but rather due to semantic, pragmatic, and cultural considerations, as this quote from Dixon about Tsovatush illustrates. The results Heliski obtained were determined partly by speaker's worldview and by other pragmatic factors. She mentions, "When I constructed the first-person form of the verb to get poor in Tsovatush using S equals A marking, my consultant did not say categorically that it wasn't possible. She said it isn't possible because you would never want to be poor." As the Tsovatush examples above illustrate, fluid S languages are not nearly as restricted as split S languages are in terms of marking. Tsovatush uses case markers, as does the Eastern Pomo language from Northern California, but the Tabasaran and Crow languages use verbal agreement instead. By contrast, most split S languages use verbal agreement to identify S with A or O, and few, if any, use case marking. One intriguing consequence of fluid S marking is that a lesser number of verbs may be needed due to the existence of pairs of verbs which only differ in volition. For instance, English has two words, slip and slide, which have the same meaning but differ in volitionality. I'm in control for slide, but not for slip. However, languages like Tsovatush and Eastern Pomo need only one verb encompassing these two meanings. A sentence like, I nominative, slip slide, would mean I slide, whereas I absolutive, slip slide, would mean I slip. Finally, I would like to note that, although split S and fluid S constitute two separate systems, it is also possible to combine them. For instance, it is not uncommon for a split S system to contain a set of verbs which are fluid between S equals A and S equals O. For instance, in Guarani, Chekaru with S equals O means I am a big eater, whereas Akaru with S equals A means I am eating. Although Dixon notes that this contrast is not productive, i.e., it can only be applied to a limited set of words. Well, that's the end of part 2.1, split ergativity. Next we'll be looking at more split ergativity. Until then, thanks for watching, and as always, don't like and don't subscribe.